Hi everyone, welcome back to our lectures on Ottoman history. We're going to be talking about the Islamization of Anatolia, specifically between kind of 1100 to 1500. This is a long-term process in which basically most of the population of Anatolia became Muslim. Now, if you remember 1073 or 1071, there was the Battle of Manzikert. This is when the Byzantine/Arab or Muslim frontier collapsed after this battle. The Turkish tribes and the Seljuks kind of streamed into Anatolia. New Turkish Persian dynasties like the Seljuks established themselves in central Anatolia. The Byzantines eventually reconquered the coast, but there was always a Muslim presence, a strong Muslim presence in Anatolia. By 1500, so by the time the Ottomans had already been around for 200 years, we know that around 90% of the population is Muslim, right? So we went from a predominantly Christian population, almost all, to Muslim population, with some areas being 98% according to surveys, population and tax surveys that were being done by the Ottomans in 1500. So this leads to a question: why did this area become Muslim? Because this is different from what ends up happening in other parts, like the Balkans, where the majority of the population remained Christian until the 1800s and so forth, even though they were under Ottoman rule. So how did the population of Anatolia become Muslim? Now, there's two options here. One is that the Muslims migrated in and displaced, in terms of demographics, the Christians, right? So the Christians died or moved away or fled. Muslims moved in, settled into those same towns, and took over. The other option is that the population converted, right? So the local native Christians basically converted to Islam in different ways. Of course, there can be combinations of the two. Now, one of the ways we can kind of look into which of these is probably more likely or unlikely is DNA evidence. Now, this is still a very early stage of research because there just hasn't been that much work done on DNA from graves from the medieval period in this part, but we do have one study from Sagalassos, which is a place in medieval Anatolia seen here, which suggests that between the 11th to 13th century, there is a continuity of population. So basically, people did not flee. Burials continued to go on. There is no Central Asian DNA markers here, which suggests that this wasn't a process of displacement, right? It's not tribes coming in, Christians fleeing, and Muslims eventually settling down in these villages. Instead, probably what happened is slow but widespread conversion. Now, that brings us to the question of what does conversion actually look like? Now, we might think, okay, you say, I'm going to convert to Islam. Now, what does that mean? How do you convert to Islam? Well, technically, there is a way today to convert to Islam, just like there is a way to convert to Christianity, etc. That means you're breaking free from your old community. You say a declaration of faith. In the case of Islam, you say, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And by making that purposeful and specific choice, you're leaving your home religious community and you're moving into another. Now, that's our vision of what it means. So it's a major transformation of the self, a purposeful choice that you go out and do. But there's other ways of thinking about conversion, and that might just be a slow change of daily habits over the course of generations, right? So if you, for example, go to yoga, you don't think that by doing yoga you're somehow converting slowly or participating in Hinduism or aspects of ancient Indian religions or so forth. Or there's other aspects of daily transformations of our lives that we don't even think about as a type of religious practice, but that are slowly changing our habitus, that is our ways of doing everyday actions, and with that, our beliefs. Now, what we're going to look at is how did those daily actions and beliefs, that habitus and that daily religious life change in medieval Anatolia. Now, we tend to think of places like mosques and madrasas as Islamizing institutions, like institutions that ended up changing the life habits and religious views of the population. But as we saw before, on the frontier, there just weren't many mosques and madrasas. You found a few of them in the cities, but overall, it's actually interesting. Sultans at the time, like the Seljuk Sultans, were just not interested in building mosques. The madrasas that were built, like this one here, seen in, I think this is Sivas, were mostly built by artisanal classes. So they're migrants from Iran coming to the cities and kind of wanted to support a madrasa. But we just don't have this type of architecture. We don't have those institutions, spaces of religious piety, right? Instead, we have lodges, as we said. One of the interesting things that we do have in that Seljuk sultans and medieval Anatolian sultans, Muslim sultans, were interested in building were actually caravanserais, palaces. They wanted lodges and shrines. So those are the three things: palaces, caravanserais, lodges, and shrines. Four things. That's what they actually spent their money building, right? And if we go look for the traces of medieval Anatolia and Muslim life there, that's what we're going to find. And this is really an architecture of hospitality, right? A lodge, a caravanserai, a palace, a shrine. These are places where you can stay and host people. Now, what is a caravanserai, you might ask? A caravanserai is basically a compound word, caravan. So, people moving camels and horses over long distance, they're going to trade or migrate, etc. A sarai is a word for a palace. Now, caravanserai, as caravan palaces, provide travelers basically lodging, shelter, animals, food, and medical care for a few days free of charge. It's basically a public service. It's infrastructure, right? And the caravanserais, if we look in this period, in the Seljuk period, we can actually find that there's a massive increase of caravanserais in the 12th and 13th century in the Seljuk period. Look at all these green dots on this map. You can clearly see the roots and how they're being built up, how they're specifically setting up trade capacities here. This orange part is the Byzantine realm, but you can see clearly just how many of them they built over a 100-year period, a massive amount of caravanserais. Now, what's also interesting, though, is that the caravanserai also contained a mosque, a muezzin, that is a person who does the call to prayer, and a preacher. So they had one mosque with 2 employees in it. And this is probably the first time that both Christians and probably to a lesser degree also the nomadic Turkish populations encountered Islamic clergy of some sort. This is a space in which locals encountered Islam, especially in this kind of more formalistic theological version. But most people actually engaged with it, as we pointed out in previous episodes, not in the mosque, but through the lodge, what's called the zaviyeh or the tekke. The lodge is basically, again, another piece of this architecture of hospitality. We talked about it. It's sort of a soup kitchen, lodging for travelers / space for religious ceremonies. They're usually in the countryside. They're usually in this sort of T-shaped format. We don't find them today because they've been converted to mosques. But what you have here is a space in which people can get food, get shelter, get treatment for their animals and medical things, and then also, if they want, partake in sort of Sufi ceremonies like the Sama and so forth. This is a famous one in Bursa, the Yeshil Jami, which you can kind of see through. We went through this in different ways. Now, many of these lodges were run by the Futawa. Futawa is a word that basically means brotherhood or fraternity, from Fata, which means young man, Fata. And Futawa is a word derived from that root, which means a fraternity or brotherhood, right? These are very similar to what we saw in the travelogue of Ibn Khaldun as Ahi brotherhoods. Ahi means brother. It's probably very closely related to that, even though some people say that's from a different Turkish word. Anyways, Fatawa in Arabic means manliness, chivalry. It also just means brotherhood. In Persian, they were called Javan Mardi. But this is an idea that started off in Baghdad, in 12th century Baghdad, so 1100, right around the same time the Anatolian world was opening up to Muslim migration. And then with them spread into Anatolia and Iran in the 13th and 14th centuries. And what you ended up having to do is a bunch of bachelors. It's like a frat house, right? A bunch of young men come in, hang out together, and they're working, usually as artisans. They would eat together, they would pray together, they would play together, they'd go to bathhouses together. They're basically a frat, and they have a very, what you call a strong code d'esprit, or I guess it would be esprit de corps. I have a mistake there. But what you have is this very strong social bond between young men. They had, just like frats today, they have initiation ceremonies, they have rule books, they have rival frats, etc. And the point is that this becomes a space of also religious encounter, because these people are praying together, they're hosting, they have these lodges, and as we saw in the travelogue of Ibn Battuta, they're also fighting with each other about who's going to be hosting the travelers that come through, who's going to give the best hospitality. Now, fatwa orders were originally for Muslims, but in these mixed cities, in these spaces of medieval Anatolia, where the majority of the population is Christian, Christians started entering into it because they were also doing the same trades, and so they become spaces of Islamization. Now, by Islamization doesn't mean that they go in and say, you become a Muslim or we're going to kill you, etc. That is not how Islam occurs. It's this daily transformation of practice, right? So they're like, okay, if we're eating together and doing and going to the bathhouse together and doing all this other stuff, well, you might as well come and pray with us once or twice, or come visit this tomb. And so we see this type of slow transformation of daily habits in many different places. This is a place I just found called Yagegis, which is today basically in the Republic of Armenia. There is a church there, but you can find there Jewish gravestones, but you can also find, interestingly enough, Arabic and Armenian gravestones. That is, on the same gravestone, you have one piece of Armenian and one piece of Arabic. Now, if you were to look at what those inscriptions said, on the Armenian, you say, faithful servant of God, martyred. Okay, so he was a martyr for Christianity, right? In Yagig's Truth, Faith of Conversion, blah, blah, blah. His name is Tava. Which is short for Tawakul, right? Tawakul is an Arabic name. So he's being prayed for by Christians. But here on the Arabic side, it said this is a martyr. So he's also a martyr for Islam. God forgive his sins. His name is Akhi Tawakul. Akhi means brother, right? He's part of this Akhi brotherhood. He died in 1351 or 801 in the Armenian calendar. But what you see here is the same person with two different sides. He has a Christian side. He's fully accepted of the Christian community, but he's also part of this Muslim Akhi community and regarded as a martyr in this way. We see this is what we call syncretism, right? The blending of two different traditions into one hybrid identity. And we see this in all sorts of different ways in medieval Anatolia. So we can look at religious symbols, how they become intermixed in different ways. So this is a famous icon of St. George slaying the dragon. If you've ever been in a Catholic or Orthodox church, you've probably seen this. He's on a horse, he's taking the spear, shoving down the dragon's throat. Now, this becomes a sign of the Seljuk Sultans. So the Seljuk Sultans are a Muslim dynasty ruling Anatolia at that time, but they take the same horseman, the spear, sometimes with dragons, sometimes without, and turn it into their symbol of their rule. And we see this also in the Danishmenids and the Seljuks and other people. On the other side of the coin and on the edge is Arabic inscription, but the basic sign is that the icon of St. George. Now, one of the interesting things is that this St. George figure is not just seen as Christian. In fact, he had become combined with a few different ideas. One is the idea of the prophet Elijah, who is a prophet in Islam. St. George becomes come under that. And also with this figure called Hizr. Hizr is a Khidr in Arabic. Hizr in Turkish literally means green. He's known as the Green Man. He was one of the companions of Alexander the Great. He apparently appears in different times, also gives, well, there's two different traditions. There's the Persian tradition where he hangs out with Alexander the Great and shows him how to find the Fountain of Youth. In the Quran and other places, he appears to Moses and gives him advice. Anyways, all of these different figures, St. George, Elijah, Hizr, and ultimately St. Theodore, become combined into some sort of a generic holy man figure, green man figure, that is still celebrated today in parts of rural Turkey and elsewhere in this area, in this festival called Hizr Elez. And there's shrines to him throughout Anatolia. So this becomes a site, the shrines to this figure, Hizr, Elijah, St. George, St. Theodore, etc. This hybrid figure becomes a site in which Christians and Muslims are meeting and worshiping in the same place. And we also see this we see Byzantine sites turned into kind of shrines in many different ways. So this Byzantine monastery in Anatolia, it was a monastery. The wife of the Sultan, Seljuk Sultan, had a dream. She had a dream in which this warrior saint called Batal Ghazi. Batal means hero. Ghazi is a warrior for the faith. Moves in, has converted this place into a shrine. She has a dream that his grave is in that monastery. She has it converted into a shrine. This monastery functions as a shrine and a monastery, becomes a site of joint interaction. So we have some questions here. One is, what did Christians participating in the Fatuha rituals or visiting Islamic shrines, did they see themselves as converting? Or is this just kind of a daily habit that they were inculcating? And at which point do those daily habits transform into a clear religious identity as a Muslim? The other question here is, of course, if this is what being Muslim meant for them, that is visiting a shrine or being part of an Ahi brotherhood, how much formal knowledge of Islam did they have? Did they know that the Prophet Muhammad was the most important prophet? Did it matter how many times they prayed? Did any of these ideas matter? And the third one is, can we think of a different concept than conversion to describe this process? Maybe Islamization, a long, slow process of Islamization, is better to describe what's going on. Think about it.